My guest today started working in education in his teens, walking into classrooms in Nepal and seeking to transform how children learn. Mohit Rauniyar is the founder and chairperson of Canopy Nepal, an education nonprofit that has reached over 23,000 students across more than 200 schools in Nepal, using storytelling, creativity, and partnerships with local governments to make learning meaningful for children who might otherwise not stay in school at all. A graduate of the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a Cheng Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School, he is also a global shaper at the World Economic Forum and has over 14 years of experience in education and social impact. All of this before his 30th birthday. In Nepal, only about 27% of students complete upper secondary education. Mohit saw that gap, first passively as a frustrated student and then as a young teacher, and decided to do something about it. In this conversation, we talk about the difference between being in school and actually learning, and why that gap matters more than ever. We get into what it takes to convince a government to adopt your curriculum, how to keep building when the external environment keeps shifting, and the thing he'd warned his past self about. I'm your host, Aishwarya G. Rai, and this is Next Gen Doers. Mohit, welcome to Next Gen Doers.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ashwari, for having me.
It's my absolute pleasure. I'd love to get started by asking you what's something you're really excited about lately?
I think last year specifically has been very, very difficult, very challenging for us. But I think there are a lot of opportunities. We're transitioning on some of our strategies. So I'm just excited that one of these strategies work. Yeah.
Well, that's good to hear, and I'm fingers crossed from my end for sure. You've been a teacher and now founder as well, but let's go back to when you were a student. Can you point to a favorite moment that you might have had as a learner?
I will start with not my favorite moment, and then I'm going to transition to a favorite
Sure.
moment. Then I think that will make sense why this is happening. So one of the not so favorite moment as a student was when one of my teachers in grade 6 used to give us this quote unquote punishment if we were not able to memorize answers by heart. And imagine 20 answers, 20-page long answers. We had to memorize each word. And if we missed even a single word, we had to write them 10 times, 15 times, 20 times, depending on our mood or depending on how difficult the chapter was. That is
Mm.
something that I still remember very vividly. And I think as I transitioned to grade 7 and grade 8, I think I encountered a few very good teachers that made me fall in love with just learning and discovering and being curious and letting me ask questions without calling me a troublemaker. So I think those two distinctions, from a not that great moment to a very, very, a teacher that can actually inspire, give you space. I cannot point to one, but I think this particular teacher in grade 9, I think she just created such a magical moment for us throughout the year that made me realize that, hey, learning can be fun. It's not all about just memorizing things, and it's not all about just blurting out what you remember, but actually discovering and, trying to find out your passion and what's interesting. So two stark differences. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, and nurturing that curiosity, right? And then that's kind of what creates a sense of ownership over one's learning as well. It's just letting the mind, that to a young mind, crawl through the world and learn through its own curiosity. That makes a lot of sense. You work in a space that's very close to my heart, and that's actually how we met just over a year ago, right? And to put it clearly into words, education. You said that your catalyst for starting Canopy Nepal wasn't one moment, and I think that's very interesting. It was a culmination of frustrations as both a student and then a teacher. I want you to walk us through that. The the system, what did it feel like from the inside as a student? What was it that you were missing, those frustrations?
I think to some Nepali education a little bit, I think it's all about memorizing, trying to score as good marks, grades as possible without much learning happening. So you'll see students, you'll see um, excellent grades, but without any knowledge, any understanding, any curiosity, any engagement in the process. And I think I was extremely frustrated by not having a space to speak, not having a space to learn, not having a space to really ask questions, but having a lot of space dominated by, hey, just memorize this answer, go to the examination, and you'll be completely fine. And that's a technique that clearly worked for me, for a lot of us. But I think that frustrated me a lot because there was no real learning happening. And I think schools should be a place where learning should be welcomed. Students should not be scared of their teachers. It's a very simple thing. And when I transitioned from a student to a teacher at the age of 17, 18, 19, that's when I realized that, it's all about creating a nice little environment for students to actually foster, to actually feel safe to ask questions, good questions, bad questions, quote unquote dumb questions, so that's where you give them space to actually learn.
Absolutely. And I think, especially in this current moment that we're in, right, where I'm not sure if this necessarily applies to what Canopy is working on, but like thinking about the technological divide that's coming up and widening. And it's very noticeable across the global north and the global south, but thinking about how those critical thinking skills and those, ability to work outside of rote memorization, rote learning, and think, and not rely on memory or be it, AI to
Yep.
think. That's definitely something that's popped up, and a few teachers I've spoken with have noted that in their younger students, this almost dependence popping up. So I can understand this frustration seems to wear different masks and look slightly different in different places. You pointed to a really interesting statistic of 27% of students in Nepal completing their upper secondary education, only like just over a quarter. And that's a very staggering statistic. When you were a student yourself, could you see this issue live? Or was it something that, you went through your education, you got to the point of teaching, and then it became apparent and the stats were there?
To be very honest, when I was a student, I never paid attention to this stat, never paid attention to the fact that students were dropping out, never paid attention to this problem. And I think this problem really became apparent to me once I finished my secondary school and I started working in the community in with public schools. And in Nepal, there's a big difference between public and private schools. The private ones generally better, the public schools generally under-resourced, lack of good teachers, or lack of resources, stuff like that. And when I actually started working in the community with these schools, with these teachers, that's when I realized that this problem was very apparent, because students having to drop out of schools at a tender age of 10, 11, 12, whatever, like very young, simply because the family did not consider education was important, or the family did not have the resources to continue education, or be it gender issues, be it cultural issues, be it distance, the geography. And I think it's such a shame that at an age where I thought education is just available to everybody, kids were dropping out and just continuing on to either supporting their families by daily wage earning, or they were taking a path that they should not be taking. So I think that's, as soon as I got into the community, that's when it became more apparent. And as I started working with schools and teachers and parents and students, I understood why it's happening, what the core problems were, where it lied, and even got a glimpse of what can be done to change it, or the solution that was out there.
What's interesting is even within the first few minutes of our conversation, it's very clear, I hope, to our listeners who not all of them are in the education space, right? There's a difference between being in school and actually learning. And one thing you've definitely noted is that part of this issue, especially in the context that you're working in, is a resource problem, partially. But would you say it's also a design problem?
Yes, it's definitely a resource problem, but it's definitely a design problem that is often overlooked. I think the education system, at least in Nepal, is designed in such a way that it discourages students to learn. It discourages students to really come to schools. I think there's no excitement. I think as a student, the kids should be excited to go to schools, to learn, to meet their friends, to play, to engage, to ask questions. But I think the system is created in such a rigid way, difficult curriculum, and the passing of curriculum from the teacher to the student is just not done in the most, sophisticated, nice, easy way, that it's made difficult. And I think there are a lot of layers of problem that just make students not want to go to schools, right? And even when they are
Yeah.
inside a classroom, there are a lot of challenges, be it a teacher not being as friendly, be it a teacher being that authoritative figure that scares them, or even problems like not having a meal in the school, so they're hungry, and because of that, they get sick, and because of that, they miss schools and stuff like that. So it's definitely a resource constraint problem that we're facing, but very
Right.
much a discipline as well.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And I think what's really interesting about your answer to that particular question is you do work with the government still. So part of the design problem is you're not adding an additional layer. It seems like you're working with the systems that already exist and trying to mend the gaps that are there. And we'll get to what those gaps are soon in our conversation. But before that, we have a segment on Next Gen Doers called Still Figuring It Out. And in this segment, I'd love to hear from you. What is something that you are still figuring out? Because no matter where someone is on their journey, and I mean, you've been doing this for a decade now,
A little
right?
more than, yeah.
Yeah. And, one would think, hey, a decade, that's expertise right over there. But everyone's still figuring things out. So what is that for you, personally or professionally?
I think the last couple of years have especially taught me that you have to be very adaptive to your situation. I think we work on strategies, we work on goals for the years and for the next 3 years and for the 5 years. We create fundraising strategy, we create program strategy, and then suddenly there's something that comes up. So I think something that I'm constantly learning, and I think our organization is constantly working on, is just being a little more adaptive,
Okay.
and every year it's a little more adaptive, to the situation, to the problems, to the good things, to the positive receptions that we get, or even the negative ones that help us become better. So yeah.
I like that. I like that. And I think for our listeners who are not necessarily plugged into the nonprofit space, and Mohit, let me know if this is not applicable to you, but the last year was quite difficult for many nonprofits around the world. Changes that happened in the both humanitarian and development sectors upended a lot of really impactful programs via funding changes, and a lot of them had political undertones as to why they changed. And the ripple effects have been setbacks to progress made, and for organizations like Canopy having to adapt to the situation. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Absolutely. And I think I would be very surprised if there is any nonprofit that is not going through this problem. And it's quite commendable if they're not going through this problem. But almost all the organizations or people that are working in this sector that I speak to have been facing it and are trying to come out of it somehow, or massively changing their strategy, or just trying to survive. And I think at this point, it's very important for just the nonprofit sector coming together, supporting each other with resources, with ideas, with collaboration and
Yeah.
stuff, which we're trying our best to do.
You started Canopy in 2015. And sorry, if you don't mind my asking, how old were you at the time then?
I was 16.
Wow. Okay. What did that first version look like from day to day? And the reason why I ask that, when someone thinks about an organization, company that's like, gone through over a decade of development, it's hard for some people to imagine the seed that it came from. But it's so important to remind ourselves that it started somewhere. So, what was the work like? Who was in the room? What were you doing? Tell us.
I'm gonna rectify my sentence. I was 16 when I started working in education, but Canopy came.
Okay.
So as you were saying, I'm like, wait, that's not correct. So apologies to the listeners, but that's when I started working in education. But to answer your question, Aishwarya, I think those initial moments, those initial days, definitely very confusing. I mean, one thing that I constantly got was like, what is a young boy going to do? I have received comments like, like when I tried working with teachers or tried working with schools, I've received comments like, hey, you know what? I have more experience that is more than your age itself. So what is it that you're going to teach me? So very harsh comments. It's good that these people who've given me those comments are now Canopy partners. They've seen the change, which is a great success story, to be very honest. But I think it was
Mhm.
um, extremely tough just trying to navigate what is it that I am doing? Is it the right thing that I'm doing? Is it the wrong thing I'm doing? What are the strategies? Whom do I reach out to? But I think the good thing before starting Canopy was I was engrossed in the space of education for almost 5 years, which
Mm.
made me realize who are the stakeholders, who are the people I can talk to, what the education ecosystem looks like, what are the problems, where are the solutions. And I think in this space, I think people also recognize my work. So when they found out that, hey, there's a solution that is coming for the problem of, let's say, accessibility or interactive learning in classrooms, they started to help. So I think when Canopy really happened, it was I didn't have a paper that said, hey, do this and do that. It slowly started falling in place, and I still don't think it is perfect even after a decade. But it's just, it just started working out. The team coming together, but the team falling apart, people coming together, but people going apart, schools really being super excited about the program, but not completely adopting it for whatever challenges. So I think the initial days were very, very difficult. I think one thing that
Mhm.
I deeply believed in was that the organization's vision is just amazing. And if we're even able to do a tiny fraction of what we are aiming to do, it will really lead to an impact, to a change. And I think that belief really pushed us and directed us to the right people, right schools, right resource, right funding, and stuff like that. So yeah.
But bringing it back to that, first early stage as well, I think you mentioned that the perhaps one of the first sessions included Roald Dahl's Matilda. And this might be basic. Roald Dahl was easily my favorite author when I was a kid. Tell us about that moment. First of all, why Matilda of all books? And then what happened in that room? Tell us about what was going on in that moment.
I mean, to be very honest, going back to that moment really makes me very excited because honestly, we had at least 20 suggestions for books, but we really picked up one because we wanted to use that one book, take it to a classroom, a public schools classroom, and make sure students are being introduced to stories. And I think me being somebody who grew up listening to a lot of stories from my grandmother, from my mother, was very engaged in just the entire storytelling process. I thought, if we are able to engage kids in the action of reading and writing and reflecting and being a little bit critical of, wait, why did that particular character do this, or what would have happened if that character did this. So I think just to take them into that process was absolutely amazing. I still remember it was in one of our schools in Kathmandu city, a public school where we had exactly 8 students attending it. And surprisingly, one of the teachers had joined the classroom as well. And our initial thought was that she was trying to be critical because the school had taken away her extra class and given it to us. So we thought that she's actually trying to stay in that class to be critical, to find the flaws so that she can go back to the school and be like, hey, why did you replace my class for
Mm.
this thing? But when we spoke to her, she told us that she really enjoyed being in that session and she wanted to take some notes, some tools that she would implement in her class. So I think that was a great motivator for us to continue. It's not just the kids learning it, it's the teachers actually taking notes and trying to, and who would eventually use that in their curriculum or regular classes was just a great feeling. And Matilda itself is such a strong book that can be, you can just go on and on with, I think Roald Dahl has this beautiful ability of getting you engrossed in his world of what he's written.
Mm.
So I think kids were getting a glimpse of it, and these were kids probably reading stories for the first time in their lives. And I really mean when I say that. And the problem is that deep where students are not even engaged in s- exchanging stories or even reading books. So I think we
Yeah.
probably instigated that into getting them involved in more stories and reading and, just the culture of exchanging stories and conversations.
That's really beautiful. And just to put us in that, moment, how old were these students at the time, would
Uh,
you say?
they were grade seven kids, roughly between anything between age 12 to 14, because, there might be that difference. But yeah, these are like 14 years old who have not been exposed to stories at all, at least directly through a book.
I think it's a very cool choice, by the way, because my memory of Matilda, it reminds me of teachers and good teachers, and also this connection with learning and of being a student as well. Like that was a very resonant theme throughout the book. So great choice, in my opinion. But also that's a very beautiful moment, and I'm so glad that also incites some excitement for you. Almost more than 10 years on. And you mentioned that, the proof of concept, if you will, came from the students and parents and teachers and working with them. And in a metrics obsessed world, right? That one that wants the stats that indicate how did you achieve these learning outcomes and improvements in reading. It's quite nice to hear about there was that feeling and clear feedback. Can you describe the feeling when you realized that this wasn't an idea anymore as a founder, as someone who, from being a teacher, decided to start Canopy?
To be very, very honest with you, I cannot describe how it feels. It was just amazing, the feeling of knowing that, creating a space for students to actually learn and be excited about learning and to be involved in reading a book that excites them about what lies in the next chapters is just an amazing feeling. And talking a little bit about what you were trying to say about who, like the impact that we were seeing, I think the initial couple of years, it was all about kids telling us that they want to read another book. And I think that was a big success metric for us. Parents coming in telling us that, hey, where do we buy books? And books are expensive and stuff. And they are, to be very honest. And teachers saying, wait, you've introduced this culture in our schools. Now we want students to actually go into the library and get a book for themselves. And to be very honest, in Nepal, a library is just a token. It's like an infrastructure that is there. So it's a tick mark. Kids generally don't use it. It's generally closed. The
Hmm.
books dust in it. So I think trying to introduce something like this really opened up a new culture where at least 5, 10, 15 kids now were going to the library, talking to the librarian and be like, hey, is there a book that I can take? And I think the school definitely had their restriction that they could not take it home, but at least in a lunch break or a whatever, a short break, they can stay and read 5 pages every day, which itself was a great starter for the school, for the kids, for the parents. And obviously, I think the metrics just improved over time when we started seeing them wanting to come to classrooms more, where their ability to write and speak and actually engage in conversations improved, and even their attendance improving over time. So those qualitative and quantitative wise, both metrics improving was just such a big proof of concept for us to keep continuing what we started doing.
That is really cool stuff. Part of your model involves working with the government, right? Like you implement, like I mentioned earlier, through the system that already exists, not an added layer. Um, I would love to know about that process of connecting with, government entities and the right ministries, the right people, making that work for what Canopy's goals were, explaining it, that the concept and actually implementing it.
To be very honest, when we initially started, I never thought that we'd actually start working with the government. I think um, I never thought our program or models would be shared with the government for a larger implementation. That was never a part of the plan, at least in the first, I would say, 6, 7 years of our running. But I think at some point we realized if we were to really scale, if we were to really reach all classrooms in Nepal, implement our curriculum across all the schools in Nepal, we have to either have a great institutional backing or we have to go through the government to scale at that level, right? So
Right.
then I think around year 7, year 8, we started having conversations with government officials about, hey, you know what? We have this amazing, incredible program that is improving kids' attention, their ability to actually read, write, speak, be critical, and um, their inclination to come to classrooms regularly, that is improving. So we have this incredible storytelling model. Would you be interested? And I think our proposal to the government was one of the fastest accepted proposal, which was just incredible to just think about right now. But to be adopted by the government at such a fast pace, especially by the local governments in different
Right.
districts, that was amazing. So I think right now our strategy is obviously we go to schools directly, or schools welcome us directly, but there's also this layer where we work with the local government who adopt our curriculum, who adopt our model, and be like, hey, there's like 50 schools for you. We want you to implement your curriculum in these schools, and we try to do our best to do that. So that has been going really well, and we're hoping we can do that across the country.
Yeah, fingers crossed for that too. You mentioned that when you have governments that change as well, and let's say this past year example of like funding shifts, for instance, how do you keep going when the external environment keeps changing underneath you? Because you're obviously progressing, you're reaching for that moment of perfection, that you mentioned earlier. How do you keep going when the environment keeps changing?
I think going back to how we started this conversation about being adaptable in situations, that's exactly what we're trying to do almost every week, every month, every year. It's sad that there's such a big change that comes in the country, in the world, that derails your strategies or your plans or your goals. But I think one thing that has really worked in our favor is we're never too rigid with our ideas. We're never too rigid with our strategy. We're not I think we are definitely very rigid with our vision, but I think everything around that is a little bit flexible. So we can take a piece out, insert something in. So I think with us, with governments changing, administrations changing, with a lot of fundraising landscape changing radically, we really had to adapt to those situations. So I think those strategies that we had, let's say, 3 or 4 years ago, have transformed into something different, and to some extent something better, I would say, right? And maybe 3 years down the line it might be something completely different, but as long as they fit the vision, as long as they are impacting the kids, and the access component and the storytelling component is at the periphery, it totally works in our favor.
This part reminds me of a previous conversation I've had, I think on episode 1 of the podcast, where the guest, Caleb Maru, is a founder, and he noted that in a joking way that his company every year goes through this near-death experience. Um, and it gave me a laugh, but it was also one of those moments where I was like, oh my gosh, like it really is a year to year. Like we're gonna see how this goes. And, part of the point of this podcast is for young people under 35 is who are thinking about their journey in impact and their journey in maybe doing things and starting things, that it is not always a pretty picture when you're inside it, that it is sometimes like adapting to the moment and these factors that are way outside of your control. But it's the mission, right, that keeps you going, what you have your eyes set on.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think if the vision, the mission is clear of what exactly you want to do, I think the path will slowly clear its way and exactly tell you in which direction to go. So you might not necessarily have a very, very clear path, at least when you start, but as long as you have a North Star, something to guide you. I think you're in safe hands.
Yeah, that's a nice vivid image as well. You said that your biggest mistake that you'd warn your past self about is confusing activity with impact. And that's a pretty sharp distinction to make, especially in a world which I think is increasingly filled with activity-based noise to translate into impact. What does that actually look like in practice? Could you give us an example of catching yourself doing something that might have felt productive but wasn't actually? And maybe how did you rectify that going forward?
I'm definitely very biased when I say this, but I don't necessarily think there were a lot of moments when we were engaged in activity without a lot of outcome or productivity. But I think it's a very common practice that I learned in the education space, in nonprofit sector, where organizations or people would just, and in a very practical example, would engage kids. They would engage them for a 4 hour, 5 hour session about a certain topic and expect kids to drastically change. But something that they fail to understand that, just because you are speaking to a child for 5 hours about a certain topic would not make them an expert, nor would that instill any kind of excitement in them in just a day or something. So that's a very common trend in organizations and individuals in our field. I think we see them keeping kids engaged. Yes,
Hmm.
you're engaged, you're maybe talking to them or whatever, but I think that did not necessarily lead to a great outcome for that level of hours spent with them, right? So I think for us, even to understand that our program was actually creating an impact, obviously we found out through the stories, through these lived experiences of the children when they wanted to read a book or when they wanted to come to classrooms or when parents saw a different child, a more excited child, or a teacher seeing a child raising their hands to answer a question which indicated a little bit more confidence in them. I think for us to really put that into the right impact metrics was that point when we realized that, hey, we're actually not just doing activity, we're not just keeping them engaged, we're not just
Yeah.
killing time, but we're actually making an impact towards the right direction. So that distinction is extremely important, and I hope people understand that for sure.
You know what? I'm going to go out on a limb and say I'm not in the education sector anymore. I once was. And I will say that that is something I saw firsthand a lot. I don't even mind saying from the donor side. And I completely understand where you're coming from because I can say these things. I won't expect you to say it. But, those posts and the donor visits and the very flashy boots on the ground thing that seems to drive a lot of the social media accounts and engagement with those outside of the education sector. That's not the impact area. The
Yeah.
impact is the slow moving, difficult, and incremental change that you see within a child's like attitude to learning. And I'll bring it back to curiosity, and the image that they have for themselves and what they want from their lives and what could possibly come out of their life as well going forth as well. So yes, I will fill in the gaps and say that myself.
No, absolutely. I think this sector also requires a lot of patience. So you can't just expect a change in a day, a change in a week, a change in even a month or a year, right? I think what we're trying to do is trying to create something for years and years. And we've seen kids who would have dropped out now actually going and completing their school and getting a job, which itself signifies a lot. And it's very difficult to showcase one moment or at least the initial moments of that child's experience to, because I'm connecting it to your point, to a donor, where it's extremely difficult to do that, right? So it's a lot of like these flashy images and videos that drive these engagement, but the real essence lies in that patient process of the actual change happening.
What you just noted is sparking a question for me. I'm curious if you've kept in touch or heard from a learner who, let's say, was in the early stages of Canopy and their life was transformed. Do you have such an
Many,
example in your mind?
many, many. I
Tell
can tell
us.
you a lot of examples. I think one amazing completing the loop happens in Canopy where a child either being supported through a scholarship project, let's say 7 years, 8 years ago, has come back to us and working with us, or we've seen some of the learners who were a part of the storytelling program have become the storytelling facilitators now. So they're teaching storytelling to their younger peers and stuff like that. So there's a lot of incidences where it's a lovely closing the loop moment where once they were students, now they are a part of that change that created the change in them. So yeah, I can really go on and tell you specifics.
That's okay. We'll follow along on the journey, and I'm sure we'll hear more stories. But I do want to pick on one point. So, storytelling, and this is something that you've mentioned a couple times and is obviously a big part of Canopy's work and interaction with learners. What, in your words, is the importance of storytelling?
I think I can go on and on about the importance of storytelling, but I think stories really give you the ability to imagine and imagine big. And I think in societies like ours, in communities like ours, our thinking is really narrow. Our thinking is boxed. We never see what is outside the box. We never even look outside of the window to see what a tremendous world that exists. But I think stories, storytelling, listening to stories, sharing stories really not only opens up that box, but completely disintegrates it for you, and it puts it puts the individual out there in the world for them to see that their possibility is tremendous, infinite, and they can do anything, or they can imagine anything, and they can change anything they want. So I think, yeah, that's just a little bit of storytelling and its power.
That's really beautiful, and I completely 100% agree with it. I want to turn to you as a founder and as a leader. You've noticed that or naturally, the line between you and what you're building has been blurred and flagged that pretty consciously as well, right? But how do you separate yourself from Canopy when I would imagine you've grown up together in some ways as well? Tell us about that.
But I don't necessarily think I've been able to separate myself with Canopy, because I think in a lot of instances I am the Canopy guy, right? So people might not know my name, but they might be like, hey, that's the Canopy guy, or is it the Canopy guy, or oh, you're the person behind Canopy. So that often comes. I don't even know if I would like a distinction, because I really love what I do. I love the impact that we're trying to create, and I think the process is beautiful. Is it simple? Is it easy? Absolutely not. We see a lot of ups and downs, a lot of ups and downs. But I think that's just a part of the journey. I don't necessarily think I had signed up for this crazy ups and downs, but I think because the rewards are great, just to see the change, I think you totally accept those challenges and uncertainty in life. So I don't think I have an answer to your question, but I don't think I've been able to separate myself really.
And I don't honestly know what the right or wrong answer is. I have spoken about this with someone previously on the podcast, and they noted for their own health and well-being sake that they actually did need to start separating their company from themselves. But it looks different for different people, and that's what I'm trying to get at over here, you know? There's no one size fits all of what you're meant to do over here. I'm curious, there's something someone asked me a while ago about what does the world owe you? And frankly, I don't know. But I wanted to flip the question into what do I owe the world? But I'm going to ask you that. You know, if someone were to ask you, what do you owe the world? In one sentence, what would you say?
Maybe I can give you one word, I think kindness. It's such a difficult question, but in a world that is rapidly changing, and we're seeing a lot of things. We are seeing a lot of things that we don't like. We're seeing just such a difficult world at the current moment. I think the least that I owe to the world is kindness, being just, yeah, kind to people and to nature and to everything and everyone that I encounter.
I really like that. What would you say gives you hope? And this will be particularly poignant given the year that you've probably had operating a nonprofit. But what is it that gives you hope?
It's a very ironical thing I'll say, but I think people give me hope, but people also take away my hope. Some people do, but I think largely I believe in people, and I think we really have that ability to create a change to make this world a little better, for sure.
I think there's a good book that hits that point, bang on. I think it's Notes from the Underground. And it just beautifully captures everything that you just said, which is like people are great, but they also suck. Given the nature of this podcast, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you for advice for young people who might be trying to do something similar as you. There's a massive education gap around the world, especially in under-resourced areas, upwards tens of millions, I think, over 100 million easily, for various reasons. What is some advice that you would pass on to a young individual who wants to make that impact to improve education accessibility and quality in their community?
I think when it comes to advice, it really depends on individuals. Some might stick to somebody, some might like a different kind of advice. For me, I think if a young person is really trying to go out there and change something, do not expect clarity to be right in front of you. I think, like I was saying earlier, I think what's important is to have a positive vision, a vision that really changes the society, improves the livelihoods, improves the lifestyles of people, and makes the world better. I think as long as you have a vision around that, I think even if the road is not clear, it will slowly clear out. The fog will go away, and you'll know if you're in the right track or not. But just remember the visions and the change that you're trying to create and for whom you're trying to create that change. And then suddenly pieces will start falling in the right place.
And on that note, Mohit, thank you so much for sharing your journey of building Canopy Nepal and of the brilliant work that you're doing, of notes of kindness as well. Thank you for your time and for your story.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Ashwarya.
That was Mohit Rauniyar, founder of Canopy Nepal and someone who truly believes in transforming education for learners. Two things stayed with me from this conversation. The first is his distinction between activity and impact, that in the social sector especially, it's easy to mistake presence for progress. Real change is often slow and invisible until years later. It lives in the child who used to never raise their hand, and now does. That patience isn't just a virtue in this work, it's the whole point. The second is something he said near the end. Don't expect clarity at the beginning, that the vision is the North Star, and the path clears as you move, not before you start. If what you're building is genuinely in service of someone else's life, the fog will lift. You just have to keep going through it. And when I asked him what he owes the world, one word: kindness. You can find Mohit and Canopy Nepal in the show notes. Follow their work, and if you have ideas, collaboration opportunities, or just something to share, they want to hear from you. If this conversation resonated, share it with someone who needs the reminder that impact work is patient work. Until next time, go do something.